Is Paul George back? Let's get into this. Last season in the NBA bubble, Paul George had one of the worst performances you could have possibly had in the playoffs. And many were wondering after that horrific performance, was Paul George's career over? Or in terms of him being a superstar, was that over for him? Paul George openly talked about after that pretty bad bubble performance, he really was going through it and really needed to get his confidence back. And over that summer, he really worked hard on his game to try to get his confidence back, to silence all the haters. And also obviously for himself to get back to where he knew he was capable of. If you weren't paying attention and you were just going based off the bubble performance from last year and what people were saying online, you would think Paul George's career was kind of over, or at least him being a superstar. But in reality, this season Paul George has completely regained his confidence and has been playing great. We all knew before the bubble performance that Paul George was a legitimate superstar in this league, but after that bubble performance, he really had to play well to regain that credibility that he was a legitimate superstar in this league. And even though he's been playing great, he really has to show it in the playoffs to get the credit that he deserves, because he's really not getting it right now, because the Clippers are more of a quiet team, honestly, this season. But this season, Paul George definitely regained his confidence. He's averaging 24 points per game this year, 6.5 rebounds per game, and 5.3 assists per game on a really efficient 48% from the field. And this season, Paul George has had plenty of 30-point plus games. When you look at Paul George play out there, you can tell that he has all the tools offensively and defensively. He's a legitimate two-way superstar in this league, but he really lost his confidence after that bubble performance, and he's playing much better now. But the real concern would be how well would he play in the playoffs, and that would really tell you if Paul George is really back to where he was before the bubble. But going point by point with Paul George, offensively he's absolutely great in every aspect of his game, but starting with his shooting ability, Paul George, when he came into the NBA, he wasn't a great shooter, especially from the three-point range, but he always had a pretty good jump shot form. And obviously he kept working on his jump shot each and every year, getting better each and every season with his jump shot, and this season he's playing extremely well and shooting extremely well. Paul George is shooting an incredible 42% from deep this year, which is a huge improvement because when Paul George came into the NBA, he's only shooting 29% from deep. It really just shows you the type of work that this guy has put in throughout his whole career and continues to put in. The fact that Paul George can shoot in general really opens up everything else in his game, but the fact that he's shooting such a high percentage this season, especially from three, really opens everything else up, because obviously the defenders now really need to get up on him whenever he has the ball behind the three-point line, or if he's off ball, really need to cover him tight, and then when he gets the ball, he can easily blow by them with his above average handling and super athletic ability to dunk on people or break down the defense and kick it out to a wide open shooter. And the fact that the Los Angeles Clippers acquired Rajon Rondo at the trade deadline really helps and really opens up their offense as well, because with Paul George in the corner or wherever he is, really is going to require a defender to play him tight, and Rondo can easily run the pick and roll either with Kawhi Leonard, Zubac, or whatever other center or whoever they else wanted to run the pick and roll with, and Paul George would be wide open either and hit his threes, or would require a defender to really stick on him and open up things in the pick and roll and in the paint. Paul George this season with his great shooting ability obviously helps himself in terms of scoring, but it really helps out his teammates in terms of spacing the floor and really giving them a lot of space to do whatever they need. Especially also a guy like Kawhi Leonard, who does most of his work from the mid-range or driving to the basket. Moving on to Paul George's ability to get to the basket, throughout his whole career he was always more of a slasher more than a shooter, especially early on in his career, and he was always very prolific at getting to the basket. But this season, or as I should say as his career has moved along, he's got a really above average handle, especially for that small forward size, where he's really able to get to the basket pretty easily, and then uses his super athletic ability to dunk over people, as we've seen many times before, or finish with layups around the basket. Paul George obviously didn't instantly have an amazing handle coming into the league. Coming into the league, he was more of a defensive player, and he really had to work in every part of his offensive game to get where he's at now. But over the years, he consistently got better and better with his ball handling, and now I think that's really the main reason why he's able to get to the basket so easily. I've said it for a long time, I really think that Paul George probably has the smoothest game in the NBA, and one of the biggest reasons for that is the fact that Paul George has such a great handle and is just able to flow with it through the pick and roll or whatever he's doing. And obviously the fact that he's shooting so well this season, as I said before, also helps out his driving ability because people have to play up higher on him and now he can easily drive by them and finish. When you talk about this stuff, it's really like this for everybody. If you're really good in one aspect of your game, that helps all the other aspects of your game in terms of your offensive ability. Another thing that Paul George really improved on this season, more than anything else in his game, is his playmaking and passing ability. Throughout Paul George's whole career, he was never known as a guy that was a great passer or gets his teammates open shots, but ever since he got into the Clippers, he's gotten a little bit better. But this season, he really got a lot better, averaging a pretty good 5.3 assists per game. And really, even though the Clippers got Rajon Rondo recently, really Paul George is doing a lot of the playmaking as well for them. And this is one of the big parts of his game that I thought were missing. Obviously, he was a great defender in the league. He's an amazing player offensively, and when you look at all the best players in the league, they're all two-way guys, two-way wings, and Paul George really fit that mold. But compared to a lot of the other guys who are also in that mold, Paul George really hasn't had a lot of success in terms of winning. Even though last season Paul George was on the Clippers, and many, including myself, really had the Clippers as the favorites to win the championship last year, and obviously it all went terribly for them, and Paul George was the main reason why they didn't do well in that playoffs. But I really think the fact that Paul George is opening up his game in terms of his passing is really going to help the Clippers win more games, especially when it comes down to the playoffs, and maybe win some games that they otherwise wouldn't have, just because Paul George is getting open shots for his teammate and maybe making the extra pass to a wide open guy, where in the past he wouldn't have had that ability. This season the Clippers don't necessarily have that high of expectations going into the playoffs. They're not expected to get to the finals, I should say, at least, so that might help Paul George a little bit in terms of his confidence, because a lot of players play better when they're underdogs compared to when they have all the pressure and they're supposed to win. And Paul George is definitely one of those guys. Obviously, some people think the Clippers could win the championship this year, but most people think it's either going to be the Lakers or the Nets, mostly the Nets. So the fact that most people think that the Brooklyn Nets will win the championship this season, it takes a lot of pressure off guys like Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. But I don't think it affects Kawhi Leonard as much as it did Paul George in terms of all the pressure that goes along with being favorites to win the championship. But moving on to Paul George's defensive ability, throughout his whole career, he's always been a great defender. That's the reason why he was drafted, and this year is no different. Paul George usually guards the opposing team's best player, or at the very least the opposing team's second best player, because the Clippers are such a great defensive team and have such great defenders, especially guys like Kawhi Leonard and Rondo. But probably literally on any other team, Paul George would be guarding the opposing team's best player every single night, and Paul George still does do that a decent chunk of the time for the Clippers. So his defensive ability was never in question, and he definitely has championship level defense. But the real question is Paul George back to the superstar level that he was before? Obviously, during the regular season, Paul George is playing extremely well and seems to have got his confidence back, and if he continues to play like this throughout the playoffs, 100% yes, he's back to being a superstar and back to being the player that he was pre-bubble. But the question is, will Paul George continue to play this well when the playoffs come around, or will he resort back to his bubble type performance in the playoffs? Because during the regular season especially, there hasn't really been too much pressure on Paul George, and I would really like to see how Paul George performs when the pressure is high in a playoff series against a team like the Lakers or whoever they would play. And if Paul George performs extremely well in that series against whoever they're playing in the playoffs, and if the Clippers advance past whoever they're playing, then I would confidently say that Paul George is back to his superstar ways. But until the playoffs roll around and we could really see how Paul George responds, it's really hard to tell if Paul George is back or not, because the regular season doesn't really mean that much, especially when you're talking about a team like the Clippers, who are guaranteed to make the playoffs. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think Paul George really turned his career around for the better again and is back to being a superstar? Or do you think Paul George's bubble performance is the way Paul George is going to play for the rest of his career? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps me out a lot. Until the next time, peace out, guys.